The arrest of Andrew Mountbatten-Windsor has sent shockwaves around the world, but it's not the first time a royal has been arrested and/or kept in custody. In this video from History Calling, I take you through a long list of royals who have been imprisoned in England from the medieval period to the modern day, and tell you what led to them being held and what happened to them. And spoiler alert, a lot of them met very messy ends. Just before I start, please don't take the following as the definitive list of English or British royals who were imprisoned in some way since the Norman conquest in 1066. There have been so many people who could fall into that category and who were locked up at some point that I imagine I've missed a few, so do feel free to add in any others you can think of in the comments below, just as long as they were imprisoned in England, so Richard the Lionheart doesn't count, for instance. I'm also going to throw in a few people who didn't have royal titles, like king or queen, prince or princess, but who were what I'm calling royal adjacent, and so I decided to include them as I thought you'd find their stories interesting, and also if I could only talk about people with royal titles, then I couldn't talk about Andrew Mountbatten-Windsor. We start with Robert Curthose, eldest son of William the Conqueror and Duke of Normandy in his own right in later life. In the 11th century, succession laws were a lot more flexible than they are now. Just look at how William took England after all, and so Robert didn't inherit that kingdom. Instead, his brother, who was another William, did, and after that William's death, another brother, Henry I, took the throne. Robert wasn't happy about this though, and tried to take the English crown. Long story short, he failed, and Henry ultimately captured him after the Battle of Tinchebray in 1106, and imprisoned him for life to eliminate the threat he posed to Henry's hold over England and his ambitions to control the Duchy of Normandy too. He was held in Wiltshire for about 20 years, then moved to Cardiff Castle, where he died in 1134. Moving on to Empress Matilda, born in 1102 to Henry I and Matilda of Scotland, and her father's nominated heiress after the death of what had been her only legitimate surviving brother in the White Ship disaster of 1120. By that point, she was already married to Henry V, the Holy Roman Emperor, and she would marry as her second husband, Geoffrey V, Count of Anjou, in 1128. When her father died in 1135, her cousin Stephen seized the throne, and this led to a civil war known as the Anarchy when she tried to get it back. In the course of this, both were imprisoned at different points. Matilda was besieged in Arundel Castle in 1139, which I'm treating as a kind of imprisonment, as it did after all keep her confined to one place against her will, but for reasons which are unclear, Stephen agreed to let her leave. He was captured by her forces after the Battle of Lincoln in 1141 and imprisoned in Bristol Castle, but he was released that November as part of a prisoner exchange. Finally, Matilda was besieged again in Oxford Castle in 1142, but managed to escape through the snow dressed all in white. The upshot of the anarchy was that Stephen remained king, but after his death, the throne went to Matilda's son, Henry II. That brings us to Matilda's daughter-in-law, Eleanor of Aquitaine, born in 1124 and married to Henry II in 1152 as her second husband. Their marriage produced many children, but by the early 1170s, things were increasingly rocky, as Eleanor sided with her eldest son in a power struggle with the king. This led to the Queen of England being imprisoned between 1173 and 1189, first in France, then in various locations in England. We don't know exactly where she was for much of this time, but Ludgershall Castle and locations in Berkshire and Nottinghamshire have been mentioned. She was only released in 1189 when her husband died, and she herself passed away in 1204. From one famous French-born Queen of England to another, we come to Isabella of France and her unfortunate husband, Edward II. Isabella was born in about 1295 and married to Edward, born in 1284, in 1308. He was king already and remained so until 1327 when he was deposed, having been betrayed by none other than his wife, with whom his relationship had deeply soured and who was having an affair with a man called Lord Roger Mortimer. In 1326, Isabella took control of her and Henry's eldest son, Prince Edward. She and Mortimer made an alliance with William, Count of Hainaut, and they invaded England. King Edward proved unable to stop them and was captured in November and locked up, first in Monmouth, then Kenilworth castles. He was pressured into abdicating in favour of his son, who became Edward III. The former Edward II was moved to Berkeley Castle, where he died on the 21st of September 1327. We aren't sure what the cause was, but there has been much speculation then and now that he was murdered to prevent him being restored to the throne, and one horrific but unproven story is that he was killed by having a red-hot poker shoved up his you-know-what. His usurpers would face their own reckoning, though. Edward III was a minor, and his government was initially run for him by his mother, Isabella, and her lover, Mortimer. They were greedy and corrupt, though, and by 1330 young Edward had had enough. He arranged a coup. Mortimer was executed, and now it was Queen Isabella's turn to be imprisoned. She was locked up in Berkhamsted Castle, then Windsor Castle, then in 1332 moved to her own home at Castle Rising in Norfolk, from which point she was basically free again. Certainly she was allowed to travel around the country. She died in Hertford Castle in 1358, having become a nun of all things. Next, we have King Richard II, who was born in France in 1367, the son of Edward the Black Prince and Joan of Kent, Princess of Wales. His father predeceased him, and so he became king at the age of 10 in 1377 upon the death of his grandfather Edward III. Fast forward to 1399, and Richard was unpopular with many of his nobles, including his paternal cousin Henry Bolingbroke, who Richard had actually exiled to mainland Europe. Bolingbroke wasn't having this, though, and after the death of his own father, John of Gaunt, Duke of Lancaster, he arrived back in England while Richard was away in Ireland, supposedly to protect his inheritance, which Richard had attempted to prevent him from claiming. That really wasn't his main goal, though. He was there to execute a coup. With most of Richard's loyal retainers with him in Ireland, there was little resistance to Bolingbroke, and when the king finally made it back to England, many of his troops deserted him. He agreed to a meeting with Henry, who promptly took the monarch prisoner, locking him up in Flint, then Chester, then the Tower of London on the 2nd of September on charges of treason. Bolingbroke now had himself declared King Henry IV, and there are differing accounts as to whether Richard willingly abdicated. By Christmas 1399, the former king had been taken to Knaresborough, then Pontefract Castle. After the so-called Epiphany plot was unmasked, which aimed to kill Henry IV and his sons and restore Richard, the ex-king's fate was sealed. The traditional date of his death is the 14th of February 1400, but the manner of his demise is disputed. The most popular explanation, though, is that he was starved to death. He was buried in the priory of the Dominican friars at King's Langley, but in 1413 Henry V had him moved to Westminster Abbey, to a tomb which Richard himself had built. Henry IV's seizure of the throne set the stage for the Wars of the Roses, as his descendants, known as the Lancastrians, and the descendants of two of his brothers, who intermarried with each other and were known as the Yorks, battled it out for the crown. This conflict also led to a shocking number of royal imprisonments over the remainder of the 15th century. In 1459, Cecily, Duchess of York, wife of one of the would-be claimants to the throne and the mother of the future Edward IV and Richard III, was captured by the Lancastrians, loyal to the then King Henry VI, after her husband was defeated at the Battle of Ludford Bridge. She was placed in the custody of her sister, Anne, Duchess of Buckingham, along with her younger children, who included Richard and his older brother George, the future Duke of Clarence. As imprisonments go, this was definitely on the lighter side, and it didn't last long. Cecily's husband, Richard, Duke of York, was back in 1460, along with her eldest son Edward, and the family were released. It was not the last time one of her children would be imprisoned, though, but you'll have to keep listening to hear more about that. For now, we turn to Henry VI. Born to Henry V and Catherine of Valois in 1421, he became king at the age of 9 months in 1422. Henry was not a particularly effective monarch, no doubt hindered by his long minority, but also by his personality. He just wasn't smart enough and wily enough to manage his vast inheritance effectively, and he relied heavily on favourites who were then hated by his other nobles. Honestly, he would probably have been suited better to the life of a scholarly monk, but that wasn't what destiny had in mind for him. He married Margaret of Anjou in 1444, but their only child, a son called Prince Edward of Wales, wasn't born until 1453, at which point the king was in the midst of a total mental breakdown that rendered him insensible of what was happening around him and led to Richard, Duke of York, being made protector of the realm. Though he recovered from that episode at Christmas 1454, the Yorks and the Lancasters continued their struggles, and eventually in 1460 the Yorkists succeeded in capturing Henry at the Battle of Northampton and detaining him in the Bishop's Palace in London. It wasn't the last time he'd find himself a prisoner. On the 31st of October, York had an Act of Accord passed in Parliament which stated that he and his heirs would inherit the crown after Henry's death, bypassing the young Prince of Wales. Barely 2 months later, though, York was killed in battle, and Queen Margaret and Prince Edward, who both remained free, were able to recover King Henry shortly thereafter. York's son Edward then defeated the Lancastrian forces at the Battle of Mortimer's Cross on the 3rd of February, took London, and had himself crowned King Edward IV on the 4th of March. Though Henry VI and his family escaped to Scotland and continued trying to retake the throne, their efforts were dealt a severe blow when the Lancastrian king was captured again in Ribblesdale in July 1465. He was incarcerated in the Tower of London, where he remained until 1470, when his wife managed to broker a deal with some disaffected Yorkists, specifically King Edward's brother George, Duke of Clarence, and their cousin Richard, Earl of Warwick, which led to the deposition of Edward IV and the restoration of Henry VI, known as his readaptation. It didn't last long. Edward IV had been forced to flee to mainland Europe with his youngest brother, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, when he lost his crown, but 6 months later he was back and he quickly retook the throne. Henry VI was recaptured and re-imprisoned, and when his son was killed at the Battle of Tewkesbury on the 4th of May 1471, King Henry was as good as dead too. He died in the Tower on the 21st of May, having surely been murdered, with the rumour being that no less than Gloucester himself was responsible, though of course the death was attributed to natural causes by the Edwardian regime. To hear all about it, see my video about Henry's death, linked on screen and below. He was buried in Chertsey Abbey and later moved to St George's Chapel at Windsor. But what of Margaret of Anjou, Henry's wife and the sometime Queen of England? Well, 3 days after her son was killed, she too was taken prisoner by the forces of Edward IV when they found her in a nearby religious house, along with her now widowed daughter-in-law, Anne Neville, Princess of Wales, and a future Queen of England herself, for she would later marry the Duke of Gloucester, aka the future Richard III. Margaret was supposedly paraded into London in a carriage and spent the next 5 years in captivity, including at Windsor and Wallingford, and was sometimes held in the custody of the Dowager Duchess of Suffolk. She was eventually ransomed to the French and allowed to return to her native land in 1476, where she died in relative poverty, by royal standards of course, in August 1482 and was buried in Angers Cathedral. As for Anne Neville, who had been born in 1456 and was the daughter of the by now disgraced and deceased Earl of Warwick, she was placed in the custody of her brother-in-law, George, Duke of Clarence, who wanted to seize her Warwick inheritance. But as I've said, that didn't last, as Richard of Gloucester married her somewhere between 1472 and 1474. Let's now turn to the Duke of Clarence, who met a very messy end and who is another one of the people I consider royal adjacent, being the brother of 2 kings. Born to Cecily Neville and the Duke of York in Dublin Castle in 1449, we've already heard how he was captured with his mother and some of his siblings as a youngster, then soon freed. He was created the Duke of Clarence in 1460, and until Edward IV produced a legitimate child in 1466, though it was a daughter which the medieval royals weren't too keen on, Clarence was the next in line to the throne. A spoilt, short-sighted, greedy idiot who wanted the throne for himself, he tanked his relationship with Edward and their younger brother Gloucester through his repeated acts of disloyalty, which included siding with Margaret of Anjou in 1470 and helping to depose his own sibling. Though Clarence soon defected back to Edward, he was chronically unable to behave himself. His wife, Isabel Neville, daughter of Lord Warwick and sister of the Anne Neville we just heard about, died on the 22nd of December 1476 after birthing their last child, which was a short-lived son, and Clarence had her waiting woman, Anchoret Twinnow, kidnapped, tried and executed in a single day in April 1477 on false charges of poisoning the Duchess. It was a usurpation of the king's authority, and when Edward found out, it was another nail in Clarence's coffin. Other bones of contention were that the king would not allow his little brother to remarry where he chose. Even the marriage to Isabel had been contracted without royal permission, and he was livid when one of Clarence's servants, Thomas Burdett, was found guilty of imagining the king's death, and Clarence had the man's declaration of innocence, given from the scaffold before his execution, read out to the royal council. The Duke was summoned to Westminster, arrested, charged with treason, and found guilty in February 1478. He was executed in the Tower of London on the 18th of that month by being drowned in a vat of wine. Yes, that is actually how he died. See my video all about his death for more information. He was buried in Tewkesbury Abbey and left behind a daughter named Lady Margaret, later the Countess of Salisbury, and a son called Edward, Earl of Warwick, both of whom we're going to get to in due course. We now move on to one of the most famous instances of royal imprisonment in English history, the so-called Princes in the Tower. Edward IV died in April 1483 and was succeeded by the eldest of his two surviving sons by Queen Elizabeth Woodville, who became Edward V. The boy was only 12 though, and then living at Ludlow Castle with his maternal uncle Earl Rivers. He was going to need a protector. His paternal uncle, Richard Duke of Gloucester, wished to fulfil this role, which was not strange really, as he was the child's senior male royal relative. But Queen Elizabeth, who was in London with her younger son, Richard of Shrewsbury, Duke of York, then aged 9, wanted the new little king to remain in her power. For a detailed explanation of what happened next, see my video about the Princes in the Tower, as I can only give you an overview here. Gloucester seized control of the boy king from Rivers and had both Rivers and the new king's older half-brother executed on trumped-up charges of planning Gloucester's death. Edward V was taken to London and housed in the Tower there, supposedly to prepare for his coronation. Queen Elizabeth, meanwhile, had fled into sanctuary at Westminster Abbey with all her remaining children, but she was soon compelled to release little Richard of Shrewsbury into his uncle's custody. He, too, was sent to the Tower. The next day, Edward V's coronation was cancelled, and very soon all of Elizabeth's royal children had been declared illegitimate on the basis that Edward IV had supposedly been married to someone else before her. The children of the deceased Duke of Clarence were also excluded from the succession due to their father's attainder. It's questionable if that was legal, but that's for another day. And lo and behold, that left Gloucester as the new king, Richard III. Edward V and his brother Richard of Shrewsbury were seen occasionally in the Tower in the weeks after they were moved there, practising archery on the green, and then they disappeared. The most popular view, then and now, is that they were murdered on the orders of their uncle, though supporters of Richard III heavily dispute this. Bones found under a staircase in the Tower in 1674 were believed to be theirs and are interred in an urn in Westminster Abbey. Personally, I would love to see if they could be DNA tested to establish their identity and possibly about how old they were at the time of their deaths, and I have a whole video explaining how that could work. I'll link it on screen and below. Richard II ruled for only 2 years before being deposed by his distant cousin Henry Tudor in 1485 and killed at the Battle of Bosworth. During those 2 years, though, Tudor's mother, Lady Margaret Beaufort, and the former Queen Elizabeth Woodville had been plotting away about how they might get rid of Richard, help Henry to replace him, and marry Tudor to Woodville's daughter, Princess Elizabeth of York. When one of these plots, known as the Buckingham Plot, was discovered and collapsed in the autumn of 1483, Lady Margaret was lucky to escape with her head, and it was only the loyalty of her husband, Lord Stanley, which really saved her. Still, her property was made over to Stanley, and she was placed in his custody without her normal household servants. Her fortunes were, of course, utterly reversed when her son took the throne as Henry VII, and she became My Lady the King's mother, and took to signing her letters with Margaret R. Even after the death of Richard III, the York family's tale of woe wasn't over yet. Remember I told you that Clarence had left behind a son called Edward Earl of Warwick, who Richard III had conveniently passed over in his own quest for the crown? Well, that boy had a pretty miserable life and death too. Though not quite royal, he had a strong blood claim on his uncle Edward IV's crown, and was of course also the nephew of Richard III, the cousin of Edward V, and the cousin of Elizabeth of York, who would become the Queen Consort to Henry VII in 1486. Let's not get ahead of ourselves, though. Little Lord Warwick was born to Clarence and Isabel Neville in 1475, and was an orphan by the age of 3. Upon his father's fall, all the lands that were meant to go to Warwick were taken by the crown, and he never got them back. He was raised by Elizabeth Woodville's son from her first marriage, Thomas Grey, Marquess of Dorset, starting in 1481, and later on he was held at Richard III's home at Sheriff Hutton. Now, as a minor, we might say he was being cared for rather than held in honourable imprisonment, so I leave it up to you how you want to view those years. In 1485, when Henry VII took the crown, though, any pretence that Warwick was a free person was removed. Henry had him placed in the Tower of London, as Warwick was the strongest male Yorkist claimant to the throne. I think we need to give Henry props, though, for not just seeing to it that Warwick disappeared or had an unfortunate accident right away. Warwick stayed in the Tower for the rest of his life, barring one brief appearance at St Paul's in 1487 to prove that a pretender named Lambert Simnel, who was claiming to be him, was actually a fraud. In 1499, another pretender named Perkin Warbeck was also ensconced there, and when it was discovered that he was planning to free himself and Warwick and depose the king, Henry VII decided that enough was enough, though the fact that he wanted his son, Prince Arthur, to marry Catherine of Aragon may have also influenced his desire to clear the decks of the major threats to the throne. Both men were executed, with the 24-year-old Warwick dying on Tower Hill on the 28th of November that year. He was buried at Bisham Abbey. The next royal on our list is one of the most famous women in English and maybe world history, Anne Boleyn. Born in around 1501 to Thomas Boleyn and Lady Elizabeth Howard, Anne spent the latter part of her childhood in France, returning to take up a position in the household of Henry VIII's first wife, Catherine of Aragon, in 1522. A few years later, she caught the king's eye, and soon it was his life's work to get the marriage to Catherine annulled, as he had no surviving sons by her, so that he could marry Anne and hopefully produce the longed-for boy. The second marriage was achieved in 1533, but its only surviving child was Princess Elizabeth, born that September. 2 miscarriages later, and with Henry's eye having fallen on Anne's lady-in-waiting, Jane Seymour, charges of incest, adultery and treason were brought against the Queen in May 1536, and she and her co-accused, who included her brother George, were locked up in the Tower of London, then tried and executed. She died in the Tower grounds on the 19th of that month and was buried alongside her brother in the chapel of St Peter ad Vincula, also in its grounds. To hear what was found when she was disinterred by the Victorians in the 1870s, see my video all about digging up Anne Boleyn. Anne and George are far from the only royals, or people adjacent to royalty, buried in the chapel. You'll recall that the Duke of Clarence had a daughter named Lady Margaret. Well, just like her father and brother, she met a disastrous end, albeit having lived a much longer life than either of them. Born in 1473, she was married off at the age of 14 to Sir Richard Pole, a half-cousin of Henry VII's. Her husband died in 1504, and Margaret survived into the reign of Henry VIII, who thought very highly of her for many years. He made her the Countess of Salisbury in her own right in 1513, and had her manage the upbringing and education of his daughter by Catherine of Aragon, Princess Mary, born in 1516. By the late 1530s, though, relations between the king and the countess had soured, thanks to the whole Anne Boleyn debacle, which had not just resulted in Princess Mary being stripped of her title and household, but also in England's split from the Catholic Church in Rome. Margaret had of course been raised a Catholic, and her son was Cardinal Reginald Pole, who was by then living in exile and loudly denouncing the actions of Henry VIII. Unable to get at Reginald, Henry vented his rage on Margaret and her other children in the most terrible way. In 1538, another of her sons, Geoffrey, was arrested for communicating with Reginald. Also swept up in this scandal were Margaret and a third son called Henry, who were arrested too. Henry was executed in January 1539. She was held at the Earl of Southampton's home, then in the Tower of London, from May 1539, but nothing could be proven against her. In fact, she never had a trial. She was condemned by attainder for having supposedly plotted with Reginald and Henry Pole against the king, and the evidence against her, a tunic found in her home 6 months after her arrest, which supposedly indicated that she supported Reginald's plans to marry the former Princess Mary and restore papal authority in England, was likely a plant. Now in her 60s, it seemed unlikely that this woman, who was clearly innocent of the charges laid at her door and posed no threat to the crown, would actually be executed. However, Henry VIII was a brute, and execute her he did at the end of May 1541. She seems to have been given no more than a few hours' notice and was killed within the Tower of London, supposedly by an inexperienced executioner who botched the job. Less than a year later, Henry VIII's fifth wife, Katherine Howard, followed her to the exact same grave in the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula. Married to the king in July 1540 and accused of adultery and imprisoned in November 1541 and stripped of her title of queen, Catherine was held at Sion Abbey. The men she was accused of sleeping with were executed in December 1541 and their heads spiked on London Bridge. But like Margaret of Salisbury, Catherine was denied a trial and instead found guilty by an act of attainder on the 7th of February 1542. She was brought to the Tower of London on the 10th and killed alongside her former lady-in-waiting, Jane Boleyn Viscountess Rochford, sister-in-law of Anne Boleyn, on the 13th. Unlike Anne Boleyn, who was her first cousin, there may have been some truth in the accusations against Catherine, and certainly she had been involved with other men before her marriage and had not disclosed these matters to the king. We don't know exactly when she was born, but at most she was in her early 20s at the time of her death. When the Victorians dug up the floor of the chapel in the 1870s, no remains believed to be hers were found, suggesting they either looked in the wrong place, confused her with someone else, or she had completely decomposed. Catherine was not the only tragically young queen to be put to death in the Tower. After the death of Edward VI in July 1553, an attempt was made to put his Protestant cousin Lady Jane Grey on the throne as queen instead of his Catholic half-sister Mary Tudor. The attempt failed and Jane has gone down in history as the 9-day queen, though to be honest I don't see her as a legitimate queen, but that's an argument for another time. She was already in the Tower at the time support for her collapsed, so all Mary I had to do was keep her there. Only 16 years old in 1553, she was a pawn of her father, the Duke of Suffolk, and her father-in-law, the Duke of Northumberland, and can hardly be blamed for the attempt on the throne. Northumberland was executed on the 22nd of August, but initially it looked like Mary would spare both Jane and her teenaged husband, Lord Guildford Dudley, despite the fact that they were found guilty of treason after a trial in November 1553 and sentenced to death. When Suffolk became involved in Sir Thomas Wyatt's rebellion in early 1554, though, which was in reaction to Mary's planned marriage to Philip of Spain and pro-Catholic measures, he doomed them all. Though Jane and Guildford had had nothing to do with it, Guildford was executed on the 12th of February on Tower Hill, and Jane saw his corpse being brought back into the Tower before it was her turn, so she outlived her husband by only a matter of hours. Both were buried in the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula, where Jane's father, Suffolk, joined them on the 23rd of February. Next up, we have the future Elizabeth I. Elizabeth, too, was suspected of complicity in the rebellion of Sir Thomas Wyatt the Younger, and she may have actually been guilty of the same, though she was smart enough not to leave a paper trail. Still, she was arrested in March 1554 and imprisoned in the Tower of London, where so many of her family members had died. She was interrogated, but managed to keep her cool and admit to nothing. It helped that Wyatt exonerated her on the scaffold as well, just before his death on the 11th of April. She remained in the Tower until the 19th of May, the anniversary of her mother's death there, when she moved to house arrest at Woodstock and was placed in the custody of Sir Henry Bedingfield. She stayed there for almost exactly a year, after which she was released, with her protector now being her brother-in-law, Philip of Spain, who could see that Mary would not give him a child and that Elizabeth would be queen after her and a potentially useful ally. Elizabeth had come perilously close to death, though, and had Mary been determined to have her head, nothing could have saved her. Lady Catherine Grey was born in circa 1540 as the younger sister of Jane and heiress to Elizabeth I's throne under the terms of Henry VIII's will. That is, until she secretly married Edward Seymour, Earl of Hertford, in late 1560 and reproduced without the Queen's consent, earning her a spot in the Tower of London with her husband, where she gave birth to their son in September 1561. This was bad enough, but the couple were allowed by their incompetent jailer to spend time together, and Catherine became pregnant again, giving birth to another son in February 1563. In the meantime, their marriage was declared void, as the only witness had died and the priest couldn't be found. Catherine remained in custody until she died and never saw her husband again. She was moved to house arrest in the home of her uncle, Lord John Grey, in Essex in August 1563, then to the custody of Sir William Petre of Ingatstone, Essex, in November 1564, then to Cockfield Hall in Suffolk in October 1567, where she was guarded by Owen Hopton. She basically stopped eating and died on the 27th of January 1568. She was buried at Yoxford before being later moved by her grandson to Salisbury Cathedral, where she now lies with her husband. Her claim to the throne passed to her younger sister, Lady Mary Grey, who followed a remarkably similar path to destruction as Catherine. Born in about 1545, she secretly married Thomas Keyes in August 1565 and was discovered within a week. Keyes was sent to the prison at Fleet, and Mary was placed in the custody of William Hawtrey at Chequers. 2 years later, she was moved to the custody of Catherine Willoughby, Dowager Duchess of Suffolk, then in 1569 to the home of Sir Thomas Gresham. Keyes died in 1571, and Mary was technically released in 1572, but with no income and nowhere to go, she had to stay as an unwanted house guest with the Greshams initially, before going to live with her stepfather in 1573 and finally setting up her own household in London. She died in 1578 and may be buried with her mother, Frances Brandon, Duchess of Suffolk, in Westminster Abbey. We mustn't forget Mary, Queen of Scots, either. Though she doesn't technically qualify for inclusion on this list as she wasn't English, she did spend a huge chunk of her life in prison there. After being deposed in favour of her infant son, James VI, in 1567, she was held captive in Scotland before fleeing to England to seek the assistance of her cousin Elizabeth I. Instead, she just swapped one prison for another, as Elizabeth kept her locked up for the next 19 years in various locations. Eventually, it was discovered that Mary was plotting against the crown, hoping to take it for herself, and she was executed at Fotheringhay Castle in 1587. After initially being buried in Peterborough Cathedral, she was later moved to Westminster Abbey on the orders of her son after he inherited the throne as James I of England. Another woman deeply involved with both the Tudors and the Stuarts, and brought down by an ill-judged marriage, just like the younger two Grey sisters, was Lady Arbella Stuart. She was born in 1575, the great-granddaughter of Princess Margaret Tudor, Queen of Scotland, through her second marriage, and the first cousin of King James VI of Scotland on her father's side. Her Tudor blood gave her a solid claim on the English throne, especially once the Grey sisters and her aunt, Mary Queen of Scots, were out of the way, and this would overshadow her whole life. Orphaned very young, she was mainly raised by her formidable maternal grandmother, Bess of Hardwicke, and though she wasn't technically a captive, in reality she couldn't really leave, despite her increasing hatred of her situation. It was only with the accession of her cousin, King James, that she was allowed away from Bess and came to court, but she soon realised that he would not allow her to marry and propagate her rival line to the throne any more than Queen Elizabeth had been wont to do. This led her to make the disastrous decision to secretly marry Lady Catherine Grey's grandson, William Seymour, in June 1610. When the marriage was discovered, her husband was locked up in the Tower, and Arbella was placed in the custody of Sir Thomas Parry and told it would be for life. The two managed to escape custody in June 1611 with a plan to meet up and get to France, but Arbella was recaptured and sent to the Tower. she would never leave it alive again, dying in September 1615. She was buried in Westminster Abbey in the same vault as Mary, Queen of Scots. A few decades later, it was Charles I who found himself in custody and facing a hideous end. Born in Scotland in 1600, he was the second son of James VI/1 and Anne of Denmark, but became king in 1625 as his older brother predeceased him. He married the French princess Henrietta Maria shortly after becoming monarch, and they became the parents of the future Charles II and James II, among others. Charles's reign and legacy are both defined by the English Civil Wars, or the War of the Three Kingdoms if you prefer, as the fighting spilled into all parts of what is now the United Kingdom and Ireland. These conflicts swallowed up most of the 1640s and were, broadly speaking, and bear in mind that I'm desperately simplifying this for reasons of time, caused by his absolutist tendencies and religious policies. Basically, he wasn't involving Parliament enough in what he was doing until he wanted more money from them. The Royalists were on one side, the Parliamentarians on the other, and it was the Parliamentarians who ultimately won. Charles surrendered himself to Scottish captors in May 1646, and he remained a prisoner almost without break until he died, moving from Scottish custody to that of the English Parliament in January 1647, then that of the New Model Army. He was moved around numerous large houses in England, including Hampton Court Palace, but his imprisonment was mostly house arrest and not uncomfortable. He was staying in beautiful manors, palaces and castles after all, and was even allowed to go hunting, receive visitors, and have his choice of books from the royal libraries. What ultimately led to his demise was his refusal to seriously negotiate with the likes of Oliver Cromwell and Henry Ireton, who tried to arrange a settlement which would reduce royal powers without eradicating the monarchy. He also escaped from custody on the 11th of November 1647 and went to the Isle of Wight, where he was promptly put back under house arrest at Carisbrooke Castle. This eventually led to the Second Civil War, which kicked off in May 1648 and which the Royalists lost. With Charles back in England, further negotiations with the Parliamentarians ultimately failed, partly due to Cromwell's lack of trust when it came to the king. Instead, Charles was put on trial for high treason in January 1649, found guilty and sentenced to death. On the 29th of January, he was allowed to see two of his children, 13-year-old Princess Elizabeth and 8-year-old Prince Henry, who were also in parliamentary custody and had been since 1642. He bid them a tearful farewell and told Henry not to accept the crown. The sentence of death was carried out at Banqueting House in London the next day, and the king's remains were interred at St George's Chapel, Windsor, in the vault of Henry VIII. Princess Elizabeth later died of pneumonia in captivity in September 1650 at Carisbrooke Castle, where her father had once been held, and was buried on the Isle of Wight. Her brother Henry survived into the reign of their oldest brother, Charles II, only to die of smallpox in September 1660, aged 20. He is buried in Westminster Abbey. Next, we have these children's other brother, James II. Born in 1633, James had actually been in parliamentary custody for a time as well as a youth, alongside Elizabeth and Henry, for he was captured in 1646. He escaped during a pretend game of hide-and-seek with them in April 1648, though, showing how lax their confinement was. His second stint in custody came much later in life. Having inherited the throne in 1685, he made himself deeply unpopular with his pro-Catholic measures, and when his second wife gave birth to a son in June 1688, and it looked like Britain and Ireland would be ruled by a new Catholic dynasty, he was overthrown at the end of the year. He was replaced by his Protestant nephew/son-in-law, William of Orange, who became William III, and James's oldest daughter from his first marriage, who became Mary II, in the only instance of a joint monarchy in English, Scottish or British history. This series of events is known as the Glorious Revolution. In the course of this messy regime change, James attempted to escape England in December to join his wife and infant son in exile in France, but he was captured at Faversham and taken back to London on the 15th of December. There he actually attempted to rule again, but really he was at William's mercy by this point. William, though, just wanted rid of him without having to kill him, and so he arranged to have James sent to Rochester, which everyone knew would be quite easy for the soon-to-be ex-king to escape from. Though he had Dutch guards, so he was technically in custody, escape from them he did on the 23rd of December and went to France. He lived out the rest of his life in exile there, apart from his failed attempt to beat William and his forces in Ireland at the Battle of the Boyne in 1690. He died in 1701 and was buried in the English Benedictine church in the Faubourg Saint-Jacques. His grave and body were lost as a result of the French Revolution. We now have a massive jump in time, as the next and final person on the list is Andrew Mountbatten-Windsor, formerly Prince Andrew, Duke of York. Born in 1960, the third child of Elizabeth II and Prince Philip, Duke of Edinburgh, Andrew is the first English/British royal who has been arrested in England since Charles I. That king's children were taken into custody but not actually arrested for a particular crime or crimes. Andrew has been having increasing legal and reputational woes for many years, thanks to his association with disgraced and deceased American financier Jeffrey Epstein. We all know what he did, but YouTube doesn't like that kind of thing to be discussed. He has also been accused by the late Virginia Giuffre of badly mistreating her 3 times, including when she was a minor. Again, I'm sorry I'm dancing around the details, but I don't want to risk demonetization, and I think this information is so widely known that you're not going to have any problem keeping up with me. As a result of the accusations, and not helped by a disastrous interview with Newsnight in 2019, in which he made several statements which have since been shown to be untrue, Andrew was first removed from royal duties by his mother, then eventually stripped of all his titles by his brother Charles III in October 2025, and moved out of his home in Royal Lodge in Windsor Park in February 2026. It is not the accusations of illegal activity with unwilling women which resulted in his arrest on his 66th birthday in 2026 and the search of his home and former home, however. Instead, it was the release of emails from the so-called Epstein files in the United States, which suggest that he shared confidential information with Epstein during his, Andrew's, tenure as a UK trade envoy between 2001 and 2011, which might constitute misconduct in a public office. It's still under investigation. Just to be clear though, as of recording this audio, Andrew denies all wrongdoing, and being mentioned in the Epstein files is not an automatic indication of any wrongdoing. King Charles III released a statement on the day of his brother's arrest saying, "I have learned with the deepest concern the news about Andrew Mountbatten-Windsor and suspicion of misconduct in public office. What now follows is the full, fair and proper process by which this issue is investigated in the appropriate manner and by the appropriate authorities. In this, as I have said before, they have our full and wholehearted support and cooperation. Let me state clearly, the law must take its course. As this process continues, it would not be right for me to comment further on this matter. Meanwhile, my family and I will continue in our duty and service to you all, Charles R." As of this video's production, Andrew has been released from custody and the situation continues to develop. There is significant pressure for him to speak to American authorities regarding his relationship with Epstein, but as a British citizen, it's my understanding that he cannot be compelled to do so, and honestly, I'd be surprised if he did it, as I don't see what gain there would be in it for him unless he could broker some kind of immunity deal first. I'd just also like to add that I am just so sorry that Virginia Giuffre, who did so much to expose Epstein's crimes and draw attention to some of Andrew's alleged misconduct, died in April 2025 and is not here to see what's happening at the moment. I always thought she was a really remarkable fighter with the courage of a lion to go up against the men she went up against, and my heart goes out to her family. And that's it, gang. Let me know in the comments if you think I missed anyone, and for more royal misdemeanours in other countries, join my Patreon at patreon.com/historycalling, where I'll be discussing a royal scandal in another European country at the moment in this week's bonus podcast, available to my top 2 tiers. I'd also be delighted if you would like and hype the video and subscribe to my channel with the notification bell switched on. It's all totally free. Let me know below what you think might happen to Andrew going forwards, and to learn more about some of the people mentioned in this video, try one of these videos next, or look at the list of videos I've given in the description box. Whatever you choose, please enjoy, and until next time, keep learning.